Hi, everyone, and welcome to our third session in our State of the Workplace 2022 series. I'm Juliette Burgess at the Burgess Law Group, and this is Christine Gannon at Brightworks Consulting. We're very excited to talk to you about best practices around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Today, we're going to actually focus on the importance of ongoing training within your organization and some of the related topics that stem from doing those trainings. So I'm going to turn things over to Christine, and we'll look forward to speaking with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Juliette. It's great to be with you again to talk about best practices and what we're learning in our community, but also in the industry related to how are companies implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and why is training so important? So I'm going to share my screen here in a minute. But again, while I'm doing that, I'm CEO of Brightworks Consulting, and we are a solutions-oriented organization that focuses on meeting our clients where they're at, specifically related to DE&I. And we're going to start our presentation and our webinar today talking about why is it so important. And one of the things that's most important that both Julia and I find with our clients is that having a general definition and understanding of what DE&I is super important, because it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And so having a common definition at your organization is super important. And so that's really actually very important when you think about training. So I'm not going to read every word on this slide. I'm sure everyone will be happy with that. But this is really a place to start in terms of creating a safe and equitable workplace where everyone feels valued. So I guess we would challenge you as an organization to visit what's your definition of DE&I in the organization. If we continue on, we're just going to look at what research says, which is that, so organizations that have high employee engagement, it's because they had DE&I embedded in their organization, and they actually are more profitable. So it actually impacts their bottom line. It also has the ability to reduce workplace harassment. And that, again, isn't just having a DE&I static program. It's a program that evolves and that shifts and changes, that it really listens to the employees, that there's employee surveys, but there's also focus groups and one-on-ones understanding what's happening with your employees. And so the statistics show having a DE&I program that's very embedded in the organization, but is actively evolving and growing, is not only important for your employee population and your culture, but also to the bottom line. So when we think about training, and then I'm going to turn it over to Julia and for your experience, we think about training in organizations for a number of reasons. One, because we want to impact the culture positively. We want to ensure that our employee population is growing and learning, that we support a learning culture, that we're lifelong learners, but also because there is an opportunity to prevent some maybe negative activities from happening. So if we are ensuring that employees are aware, that they're educated, potentially that protects and puts in place some barriers so that bias isn't so prevalent, or racism isn't so prevalent, or harassment isn't so prevalent. And so we think about training, it's not only to educate and raise awareness, it's also to prevent some things from happening. So Juliette, when you think about the clients that you see and those that come to you, do you think they could have benefit from this type of prevention?
Absolutely. I think it's critical to every organization. And I can't even tell you the number of times that I work with an organization that has really fabulous policies in place. But unfortunately, the training hasn't been done. And so the folks at the company don't actually know that they have these protections, or who to go to talk about the issues, and that there might be a procedure to make whatever the microaggression or the harassing behavior, or maybe it's just their perception of a bias, whatever the issue is, there's usually channels for them to go to talk about these issues. And if there's no training in place, a lot of times the only real exposure people get to those policies is when they first join the company and they're onboarded with an employee handbook. And, it's part of a bigger pile of paper that has a lot of policies in it. And probably on their first day or week or, they're more focused on the basics of where they're going to park and how their taxes are being deducted and things like that. So doing a separate training, I think, is really important to make sure that everyone understands and knows how to use whatever policies and protections that the organization has in place.
I think you would agree too, that it can't just be one time, right? It has to be ongoing for, new employees, existing employees, but also as the organization evolves, right?
Absolutely. And depending on what state the organization's in, for example, California, there's a requirement to do harassment trainings every year. And different states have different requirements. But even leaving that aside, I think, you're absolutely right. It's a revolving door. And so you need to make sure that everyone's getting the training on their way in. And even the people that have been there for a long time, because this is an area of the law and or society that keeps evolving and changing, a dynamic company will grow with that. And we want to make sure that we're taking all of our team members along with us, especially those who've been here for a long time and, may not be as familiar with some of the tweaks and changes that you're making to evolve with the times.
Absolutely. And I would add, when diversity, equity, and inclusion, when that became more prominent and prevalent in organizations, it really was DE&I, right? It was diversity, then we added equity and inclusion, and now there's accessibility and belonging and justice, and there's more acronyms. But at the core of all of it, it really is seeking to understand the other person and to assume positive intent and to try to understand where the other person is coming from, even if that's not your race, that's not your experience, that's not your background. When I think about all the different ways diversity shows up in an organization, we have people who have very different backgrounds. It's not just race and gender. It really is, do you have a veteran status? Are you married? Do you have children? Do you have a degree? Do you have a higher degree? I think there's so many elements of diversity that come into an organization and make up the employee population, that continuing training to educate the employee population on these topics is super important. So we're going to talk a little bit about, on the next slide, what kinds of training can you do? And it really, like we were talking about, it really works to mitigate biases and unfair behavior. It's always cultivating awareness, and it really empowers the workforce to show up differently, to offer compassion and empathy. There's these different kinds of training include just common ground training, just foundational. What is DE&I? Or what is DE&IB? Or what is DE&IJ? So just common ground training. Then there's facilitated training, which is really a very interactive training around conversation, listening to the employees. What is your experience in the organization? And how can we do better as an organization? Is there a different kind of training that you might need? There's cultural sensitivity training, and everyone knows about unconscious bias training. All organizations have been, most organizations, I should say, have been doing this for a while. Accommodation, because disability or ability is another form of diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of those that are in your organization that might need accommodations, different types of accommodations. There's community engagement training, how to effectively engage in the community that you're in so that you're making a difference and having impact. And then building respect and trust, which we get asked for a lot of this right now, in terms of how can our employees have conversation that is respectful and meaningful about topics they disagree on. So there's a lot of division. We know we're not telling our audience anything they don't know, but there's a lot of division in terms of how people see controversial topics. Maybe it's gun control, or it's women's rights, or any of these issues that are so prominent in the news right now. But what we haven't done as a society is we haven't really provided that training for adults so that they can have civil discourse, right? And so organizations are now asking for it. Please come in, show our teams how can they have discussions about topics that could provide a division and would reduce the amount of collaboration in our organization. I don't know if that's something that Juliet, you're seeing on your end.
Yeah, I think that, a lot of times when a situation gets to my office, things have already gone sideways. And it's unfortunate because a lot of times if the parties involved had that foundation of respect and trust, the issue probably wouldn't have escalated, or could have been avoided altogether. And so I can't emphasize enough how important I think building those values within an organization are. I think when people feel seen and heard and they feel respected and they trust the people that they work with, it's easier to have difficult conversations. It's easier to make organizational changes. And it's better for the organization on the micro level and the macro level.
Absolutely, absolutely. So internal training, super important for so many reasons. So how will we know it's successful? So an organization steps out onto this path and this journey of ensuring that their teams are educated and awareness is raised, and maybe they've even implemented some policies and practices. How will you know it's successful? So we go back to the old cliche, you can't manage what you don't measure. So measuring DE&I training and measuring the impact of that training shows up in lots of different forms. And we've listed some here in terms of how organizations can track it. One thing that I do want to mention is that sometimes organizations put these metrics in place, but it doesn't mean things will change overnight. So if you've implemented a robust training program around DE&I, and then you've implemented some metrics, it doesn't mean those metrics will be perfect and show up like you're such a mature organization tomorrow, because all of this is change, right? We know that change takes time. It takes a lot of, sometimes a heavy lift to implement, to change perception, to reduce resistance, to improve engagement and participation. Takes a lot of time. If we just look at pay equity, that's one way to measure the equity of people's pay throughout the organization. And that isn't, something that happens overnight. Once you conduct a pay equity assessment and you have those metrics, now what? How will you resolve it? And that's not overnight. So just think it's important to know that, measurement is key to know the impact, but then it takes a little bit. It takes some time for the ship to right itself. It won't happen overnight, even with the best training, even with the best metrics. Anything you want? Yeah, go ahead.
Christine, I have a question for you. A lot of times clients are curious about, obviously there's the metrics and there's hard data, but what about surveys or feedback from employees in terms of how they're feeling, whether they think that the environment has improved or things that they want to see more of? How do you recommend that the organizations get kind of a pulse on the subjective piece of this?
That's a great question. So we talked a little bit about that, right? Employee surveys are super popular and super key, but sometimes the data comes back in organizations either A, don't have the bandwidth to implement some of the changes recommended, or B, they don't know what to do with it. So they don't do anything. So we really prescribe a number of ways to understand what the employee's lived experience is. And one of those ways is through focus groups. So we're a third party, we're very objective, we're not part of the organization. So we can come in and offer focus groups where we listen to groups of employees throughout the organization to hear on a number of topics. How are they feeling about the organization? Do they feel like the policies and practices that are in place are equitable? Are they fair? Do they see themselves in the leadership team? If we aren't talking to leaders, do they see themselves represented across a diversity spectrum? And do they feel like it's an inclusive environment? Do they feel like the culture is inclusive? Another element that we're adding in is compassion and empathy. How compassionate and empathetic are your leaders, and how compassionate and empathetic are employees to one another? Is that a value that runs through the organization? So focus groups are key. Holding one-on-ones with employees as well to understand their lived experience. And then the employee survey, again, the employee survey gives a lot of data, but having that face-to-face time, whether it's virtual or in person, is super important to listen and to also watch body language and to hear from employees, maybe some stories of what's happening. Could be really good. It could be, we were just meeting with an organization yesterday, a very large energy company, and they were sharing that they hear very positive feedback. And this is from third parties, conducting surveys and sitting with their employees, that they feel like this organization is on track and that they're doing all the right things. And that's great, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it's, I feel very disrespected, or I feel like I don't have an opportunity to leadership. So the employee survey is one, focus groups is another, and then, one-on-ones. There's also a responsibility of the leadership team to really listen, to sit and listen, whether they're doing fireside chats or they're doing town halls or they're doing small focus groups, with a very small group of people across the organization that they can hear from. I think it shows up in a lot of different ways.
That's really helpful. And I think that sometimes some of the topics that people think of in terms of, an alternate work schedule or work week or a hybrid work environment, things that we got a little bit more accustomed to with the pandemic more recently that are part of the State of the Workplace 2022, some of those issues that, although they're not directly related to diversity, they find their way into the conversation when you do those focus groups and when you do the one-on-ones, because, if you measure your team and what issues are important to different people, and you get that baseline of what would make everyone feel safe and comfortable and valued, a lot of times, you realize that something that's non-monetary, but that's a cultural shift or a policy or a procedural change in the way that things are done, is really going to make a big difference in the morale.
Absolutely. It affects the culture, right?
Yeah.
It really affects the culture. And it affects, to your point, the morale of the employees and how productive they are even, right? How productive and how they show up, how they treat one another.
And I think what that looks like is going to depend on the population of each organization, right? What diversity looks like, or what you want it to look like, and what those people have to say about how they're feeling and what they want to see more of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the worst thing a company can do is ask for feedback and do nothing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Worst thing they can do. It's also about sustainability. So you touched on that a little bit, Juliet, in terms of keeping our workforce in place, right? We know that we've just gone through this great resignation and the great reflection, and sometimes it's called quiet quitting now. There's new terminology in terms of where people are at and their mindset around working. Creating a sustainable workforce is really about DE&I and ensuring that the policies and practices of DE&I become the DNA, not to use too many acronyms, but it really becomes the lifeblood of the organization. And these are some ways to measure if that's working. Okay, so let's look at some of the costs to where the ongoing training might fail, where it maybe doesn't work so well. So where it falls short is that potentially there's not a commitment at the very top levels of the organization, that there's a lack of commitment. Maybe there's talk, but not walk. And so it really has to be from the leadership team that they're committed, but they're committed and they're showing their commitment so that it's very tangible. I did a podcast earlier today and we talked about an organization in Arizona that had a value system that was very strong, but weren't really sure how to implement DE&I. And once they did, the recruitment and retention efforts for their organization completely transformed, because people looking for work and prospective employees are looking at organizations' DE&I programming to understand, is it just a checkbox, or are you really doing this and living this every day? It also has to extend beyond training. So today we're talking about ongoing training and why that's important, but it really needs to extend beyond training. So it has to be an ecosystem. We call it an ecosystem of equity, which is more than just training, but it's listening, it's looking at metrics, it's ensuring that policies and practices are in place and are being adjusted when they need to be. It's taking the training that happens and integrating that learning back into the actual work that's underway. So it's great to go learn about concepts, but it's kind of like the book knowledge, right? I go to college and I get this great book knowledge, but if I don't implement it, really didn't have an impact, and it probably was a waste of time. The other main thing is accountability and measurements. So if you've put in measurements, but things are failing, where's the accountability? Where does the accountability lie? Ensuring that there's accountability for when things are not working so that they can be fixed. If there's no accountability, we know that nothing will change, right? There's no consequence. I think what will change is the employee population, right? We'll have a very disgruntled employee population, and that maybe the productivity and maybe the shareholders won't be happy. I think there's a lot of domino effects of that, but there has to be accountability with the measurements. Anything you would add, Juliet?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on a lot of really important points. I think the other piece of this that I would add is just from you know, a litigation perspective. If a company is trying to minimize their exposure, in the event that they do all the right things, they have policies, they have trainings, and they try their best to create a healthy, safe environment. But sometimes, you know, people are people and things still happen. And someone is disgruntled and, you know, comes at the company with an issue, that you're also putting the company in a position where they're going to be able to say, we don't just talk the talk, we also walk the walk. Everyone that comes on board is given a copy of this policy. Everyone is educated in it. Everyone is familiar and part of this ecosystem that we have. And, you know, that is really, from a legal perspective, the best defense a company can have in trying to resolve these issues when things go south.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at that. So some things that potentially go south, maybe some things to consider around what's transpired in the society where things have gone south. What do you think about some of these, Julia, in terms of like the Los Angeles Times, my goodness, or Google, or even
Yeah.
Forbes?
I mean, if you look at these findings, these you know, award amounts in the millions of dollars, you know, the data speaks for itself. I think since the Me Too movement, you know, really several years ago, you know, gained momentum, we've seen daily headlines with people in all different industries, you know, really being called out. And whether the individual is responsible or not, it still ends up taking a lot of oxygen, time, and money for the entire organization to kind of put that fire out, even in a best case scenario, right? And so in a worst case scenario, they're going to expend all of those resources and then still be saddled with a big judgment that they need to pay in damages. And so, you know, the best treatment is really preventative. And that's why I think that, you know, to the extent organizations are already doing trainings, that's wonderful, but it makes sense to kind of check in periodically and see what we could update or how we could make them more engaging. I think we saw a lot of people during COVID really turning to virtual trainings, and I think that they're great, and I think that they're really time effective and cost effective. But there is something that is intangible that you get when you have people in the same room talking to one another, whether it's through a focus group or through a one-on-one, you know, that you lose when people just hear harassment, discrimination, diversity, and they zone out and they're checking their email instead of participating in the training. You don't end up with a really well-rounded ecosystem. And so I think it's important to constantly kind of check in and see if there's places that you can make some little tweaks to make what you're already doing more effective. But yeah, I mean, we do hear a lot, and I'm curious if you do too, about the cost of DE&I measures and trainings and surveys and you know, on the front end of it. And I think when people realize this is the cost on the back end, if you don't do all the right things and the worst case scenario happens, all of a sudden it's a really marginal cost to not only make your environment and your culture stronger, but also it's an insurance policy on the back end as we talked about, if things go sideways and you need to defend the organization.
It really is an investment, right? Like you said, an insurance policy. It's really an investment in the organization, in the employees, and in the health, right? The health and sustainability of the organization. So, absolutely. We have a lot of organizations that are hesitant to, I shouldn't say a lot, we have some organizations that become hesitant in terms of making that investment and maybe potentially not seeing where's the ROI. And so then a lawsuit happens and they're very happy to invest because they understand, had they provided training and awareness to their employees, maybe someone wouldn't use that racial slander to someone else. Maybe someone wouldn't have been incredibly biased in how they hired, or just different scenarios that happen that transpire when there isn't education and there isn't an understanding of DE&I. So what are some of the benefits? I feel like they speak for themselves, but some of the benefits to investing in terms of the increased employee engagement and more profitable workplace. But it really helps the employees know that the leadership team is on track, that the leadership team sees this as important. And so some of the indirect costs and risks that are tightly tied to that ROI is that, and we talked about this a little bit, that maybe you've lost productivity, you have the morale that's impacted, you have risk that surrounds governance. And that's incredibly important right now around ESG and the governance of the organization and shareholders. They want to know that the risk is managed and mitigated. There's a reputation risk, right? Or in eroding your customer position or your market position. So, Juliet, I think you said it, which is like, if you think spending money to obtain training is expensive, consider the cost of not advancing a safe and inclusive culture. And I think not only from a litigation perspective, but just your employees, right? And the investment that you want to make with your employees. So the benefits, again, just ensuring that there's innovation, that we're driving collaboration throughout the organization, that we're developing and keeping that lifelong learner mentality, and that the skill sets to manage and effectively implement diversity are implemented, and that there's compliance to regulations throughout the organization. So how do we do it? How do we create an internal DE&I training program? Well, number one would be to assess where you're at. If you already have training programs in place, maybe using a maturity model or some other type of assessment to determine where do you need training? Where are the gaps? What isn't working today, or what haven't you covered? Ensuring that there's a common understanding of what equity and inclusion is in the organization. Again, it goes back to that first slide we talked about. What's the common definition? Tailoring the training. Very rarely does off-the-shelf training work. It does to a certain extent, but in terms of ongoing and ensuring that it's embedded in the culture, it doesn't really work well. Planning an integrated approach, so ensuring that there's all different types of training, not just unconscious bias training. And then delivering it over a period of time, making adjustments where you need, it's based on your organization, right? Not every organization needs every type of training. It may be very dependent on the industry that you're in, and the sector that you're in. It may be very well determined, may be determined that way. Something that I want to talk about when you're creating an internal training program is mandatory is a word that gets thrown around a lot in terms of making training mandatory and versus really highly encouraging or compensating, other ways to encourage employees to attend training. Making it mandatory oftentimes has a reverse intent that happens. So employees will see it as something being pushed to them versus their interest and their engagement and them wanting to be engaged and interested in the culture of the organization. So mandatory is difficult at best, and it often backfires. I'm not sure, Juliet, if you've seen those types of things where things are mandatory in organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it can definitely backfire. I think it has a negative connotation to a lot of employees. maybe it's because the term was used a lot more in grade school as our generations were working through the corporate ladder. But certainly I hear the term a lot that we have a zero tolerance policy for that. And that's fantastic. But then the follow-up questions are, okay, great. What happens if this happens? Who do people go to? And a lot of times we realize, as you said, there's gaps in the policies or in the trainings. And so I think that when you message things in a way that encourages people to participate in the trainings or the focus groups or the surveys, however that might be, whatever the carrot is that motivates your team, that is just much more effective than sending out a scary, this is a mandatory meeting. Even though at the end of the day, from a legal compliance perspective, you may need every single person on your team to attend this. It's really about the messaging and being creative sometimes in getting people to the table in a way that they're not only there, but they actually want to be there and they're going to be active participants.
Absolutely. One of the organizations that we're working with, they from very day one of any employee joining their organization, part of the orientation is related to DE&I and the culture and explaining and sharing and training of sorts to all new employees. This is our culture. We will do ongoing training around DE&I. We hold focus groups. We have employee resource groups set up and affinity groups set up. And this is our culture. And so you can expect to see ongoing training. You can expect to see us elevating ERGs and affinity groups. You can expect to see us walking what we are talking about, what we're sharing. And so when you're able to capture the audience at the very front, day one, when you're able to capture your new employees' attention and help them understand this is the culture, then it's expected, right? It isn't all of a sudden we're making a shift and everyone needs to get on board. So not that organizations don't do this when they have existing employees, they do, but they get creative in terms of how to generate interest and how to generate engagement with their employees so that there's a desire to want to be a part of it.
Yeah, and one thing that I do in my trainings, I know you mentioned that, off-the-shelf trainings are rarely very effective, and I completely agree with you. It's certainly a good starting point sometimes, and of course it's better than the alternative of not doing anything. But the most effective trainings I've done are where we really take the organization's culture and specifically their policies around DE&I, and we look at them together in the training and we read them out loud, and everyone sees the language and has an opportunity to digest it and let it marinate. And if there's questions or comments, everyone's really familiar with where to go and what the organization is about. And so I don't think that can be emphasized enough, that you really want to measure your organization on the front end and look at what you're already doing. And as you said, evaluate where there might be some gaps or some tweaks that need to be made, and then tailor whatever the process is that you're going to go through, tailor it specifically to those issues. I think that's what's going to make it the most effective training program.
I totally agree with you. And listening, right? As part of those sessions, like you said, like, I love that idea of looking at the actual policies of the company, really ensuring that it's not just, here's what unconscious bias training is, but then reflecting back into the company. Here's how it looks for us. This is what our policy is, related to that. I think that's super important.
I think if anyone leaves the training and they can't answer, the basic questions of what behavior is not appropriate and is not acceptable, what do I do if I see that going on? If I'm a supervisor and I see it, or someone brings it to my attention, how do I react? What do I say? Where do I go? What do I do? What if I'm not comfortable going to my supervisor? Is there another person I can go to? Those are the hard questions that everyone should leave a training having their arms around and feeling like they know exactly where to look and exactly what to do if something comes up that they want to talk to someone about. And if they can't do that, you've kind of missed an opportunity.
Yes, you've missed the mark. It was great information, but now what? What do I do if it happens? So how to ensure that it's a success? So one of the things that we really recommend is that you tie it to your strategy. So hopefully there's an overarching DE&I strategy in your company, and that you're tying the training efforts as a part of that. So again, the training is just one tool to integrate DE&I in the organization, an important tool, ongoing training, but really has to link to a broader strategy. There has to be buy-in if you want it to be successful. It goes back to not making things mandatory, but encouraging people to attend and wanting them to be part of the organization's, the fabric really of the organization. Explaining the why really, and the what, Juliet, you just touched on in terms of why are we doing this and why does it matter and what will it do for me and what will it do for the company? I think those are really important questions to ask. And then measuring. Right? Measuring and monitoring the results of the strategy as well as the training.
And, you know, sometimes just to piggyback on that last point, sometimes, and I'm curious if you find this too, but sometimes the absence of data is actually a good thing, right? If you can say that the number of complaints about harassment have decreased, or human resources isn't really hearing much about that, and the company hasn't had any lawsuits or any harassment or EEOC claims, you know, in the last 5-10 years, those are good facts. And so a lot of times, you know, the absence of you know, negative information is actually a sign that you're doing the right things.
Absolutely. That's such a good point. That's such a good point. So as we finish up our webinar, we just want to talk a little bit about culture. Culture is intentional. It doesn't just happen. If you think about your family and you think about your personal relationships and the strength of those, that isn't just, you know, it doesn't happen without intention. It doesn't happen without a plan. It doesn't happen without a strategy. It's very rare that relationships last if there isn't some kind of intentional activity happening or intentionality around that relationship. And culture is very much the same. So ongoing training is one element to that intentionality, not the entire strategy, but it is one element of creating a culture that is aware, that is engaged, and creating that equitable space where people feel valued. So that is our webinar for today. Juliet, I'll toss it your way, but I'm Christine Gannon. I'm with Brightworks Consulting. Juliet and I have partnered on these DE&I series to bring you best practices. We're both available for additional questions. Just reach out to us via LinkedIn, but we're hoping that you enjoyed this webinar and that you learned a couple of things.
Thanks, Christine. I certainly learned a lot and enjoyed hearing everything that we had to say. I think that you touched on something really interesting at the end, in terms of, you know, your culture within your family being similar to what you want to create in your organization, and how it takes work, right? The flowers don't just grow if you don't water the seeds. And so, you know, I think that it's just really interesting and important to remember that our generation and the state of the workplace 22 is really made up of people who a lot of times spend more time with the people they work with than even with their own family members. And so there's this level of familiarity, and this level of, you know, everybody knows he's not politically correct, or everybody knows, you know, I don't know, whatever the topic might be. And it's important in the trainings and just in the cultural shift that you're trying to make, to be mindful of, even though we spend so much time together, you know, we still are trying to create a culture that is diverse, that is equitable, that everybody feels like they belong in. And so sometimes we lose perspective because we spend so much time with our team, and it's important to take a fresh look. And we're certainly happy to help you do that and answer any questions that come up along the way. It's been great getting to talk to you. Again, I'm Juliet Burgess at the Burgess Law Group, and I specialize in labor and employment law, and have really enjoyed connecting with Christine and Brightworks Consulting to help our clients.
Thank you, everyone.